welcome to another edition of Guitar City Talks. Today I am extremely happy to have with us here Steve Goss, who is sort of a bit of a superhero composer, you could say. He's chased by all the greatest guitarists around the world to having him write music for them. And whether it's David Russel or John Williams, who I guess also took your concerto, as I understand, on a pretty substantial tour. Quite amazing kind of events these are. And but however, I guess you started somewhere a little bit more modestly. And so maybe I would, like, when and how did Steve Goss become Steve Goss the composer?
Well, that's an interesting question, and it's not something that happens suddenly. I remember David Russell once describing in an interview that he said that his career was a slow burn. You know, suddenly he turned around and realized that actually he was doing pretty well. And I would say, the same is true of me. In fact, I still don't necessarily think really much about it. I'm just doing what I do, and everything's happened so gradually. And so, drip by drip by drip by drip over so many years that, there was never one moment where suddenly, I was thrust into the limelight or there was a kind of exposure meeting. I've just kind of gradually sort of slogged away in the background and just never given up, I think. I think that kind of refusal to do anything else has kind of helped me to
Fantastic,
extent.
yeah. But you are basically, you started off as a guitarist, or was composition always something that was there for you?
Well, I actually started. This is where the fun begins. I started off kind of as a violinist, um,
Oh,
and a
even better.
guitarist. Well, it was an interesting thing happened to me. I was basically, as a teenager, I was totally obsessed with music. Took up the violin later than guitar, actually. Took up the violin at the age of 11. Took up the guitar at the age of 8 or so.
Hmm.
But it was the violin that kind of thrust me into this amazing musical world of orchestras and friends and this sort of whole musical thing that was happening. And then at 16, I won a scholarship to a music school, basically to study composition, violin, and guitar. And then when I got there, this is Wells Cathedral School, which is one of the specialist music schools
Hmm.
in the UK. When I got there, the violin level was insanely high, and I sort of turned up with my relatively modest violin playing and thought, this is not going to go so well. And in fact, I was the only guitarist there. So this was
Oh.
my kind of special thing. And then suddenly, of course, it was people were interested in me because I had this guitar thing, and there weren't really any other guitarists around. And suppose really, I mean, in a way, that's why the guitar took precedence over the violin. Composition was always the kind of background dream. I mean, I wrote a massive orchestral piece as an audition for that school.
Oh,
It was in the style of Bruckner, very sort of 19th century orchestral
fantastic.
epic style.
And then at that time, to clarify, what was your age at that moment when you
16,
wrote that?
16.
16. Well, that's quite amazing, isn't it? Yeah. And
Um,
what happened with that piece? Is that was it played?
it was played, yes. I have a recording of it somewhere. I mean,
Oh,
it's not a
fabulous.
piece, not a piece I would put in in the public domain, particularly these days. But I mean,
I love Bruckner, of course, and so that sounds pretty interesting.
yeah. Well, it was fun, and so yeah. So I was at this music school, and then I went to university to study composition, basically, and guitar. And I went to a department that was very composition heavy. And funnily enough, when I was in that department that was composition heavy, the sort of same thing happened to me again. There's a kind of pattern here where I thought, well, actually, again, I'm the only guitarist, so
Hmm.
that'll be my kind of, the thing I can really excel at. And then I went to the Royal Academy after that as a postgraduate and did guitar and composition side by side.
Oh, I see. In your undergraduate. Oh, how interesting. How
Yeah.
was it actually to do that? Even just technically, did they have to create a special program for you, or how did that
No,
actually
I
work
mean,
out?
in my undergraduate, which was at the University of Bristol,
Mhm.
it was a pretty varied course, and I was able to do composing and performing as
Hmm.
part of that. That was great. Then when I went to the Royal Academy, I simply did first study guitar, second study composition. That's how it worked out. So I
Hmm.
did a fair bit of composing, but then in my second year at the academy, I got very into playing the guitar, and then I just wanted to be a guitarist. I just wanted to play guitar and go and do my guitar thing. Also got very interested in playing contemporary music. So I used to play a lot of big modern programs,
Hmm.
and I was quite involved in those early years with various different contemporary music groups and so on. And that's when I started my guitar quartet Tetra back in 1988.
Oh, I
Um,
see. I
yeah,
see.
and that quartet basically lived for 27 years.
Yes, right?
So it was kind of
Lived
it was
is
a lot
it's
of
not
fun.
going on anymore?
No, we stopped in
Oh,
2015. We stopped in 2015. We had our last concert at the Iserlohn Festival in Germany.
that was
Basically,
your final one, I see.
yeah, it was great actually because we one of the guys in the quartet, a guy called Carl Herring, really great player.
Hmm.
He was moving to Japan, and so there was this moment. We just had our 25th anniversary concert like the year before. We just absolutely bust a gut to learn a whole new program and
Hmm.
got a new CD out. And then with Carl leaving, we were thinking, right, so now we've got to get someone else in. We've got to start again. We've got to kind of. And it was just like, well, maybe now is the time to stop. And also, I was just getting much more busy as a composer and also doing
Hmm.
teaching stuff. So
I understand that, yeah.
it just made a lot of sense. And I must admit, I don't. I really miss playing the concerts, but
Hmm.
I do not miss doing all that practice. 'Cause the
Well,
thing is,
Steve, it
as
is.
you know, I mean, to play, I mean, solo's even worse, but even playing quartet, you have to really put the work in. Otherwise, the playing, can.
There has to be a certain amount of hours where you play together. It's not just practicing on your own. You have to practice as a group. That's just the
Yeah.
way it is for it to kind of click in. Anyway, so that is very interesting. And I mean, I have, of course, there's a great article about you on Wikipedia. And I just think it's interesting that it starts off here that it says, is a Welsh composer.
Yes.
That's something that is important to you. I would think of sort of the UK. That's would have been my
Well,
kind of.
the UK may soon be a thing of the past. Um, it's going horribly wrong for us in the UK at the moment for no
I see.
numerous reasons.
But Welsh, is that something that is important to you, that you are a Welsh composer
Well,
rather
it
than
is. I mean, it's a funny thing, but these sort of local rivalries are really quite something. Like
Mhm.
Arsenal, Tottenham in North London, Sweden, Denmark, of course, which you must know all about,
Yeah,
and
but those
Wales,
are
England
different
too.
countries. You guys are actually the same.
Well, we are sort of countries. I mean, we're sort of countries within the UK.
Yeah,
So when you grow up in Wales, I mean, there's a kind of culture that you're definitely Welsh and
I
definitely
see.
not English.
Hmm.
UK is okay. You could say you're from the UK, but the sort of association with England is not good. So, for example, with the European Championships in football coming up next month, I will be absolutely rooting for Wales. And in fact, if anything, I want I'd like England to do particularly badly. I'd rather Scotland do better than England as a sort of. So it's slightly childish, and it's very much a sort of.
Wonderful. I like it. Well, but now let's talk a little bit more musically, because this is something that is written here on Wikipedia. Is there such a thing as a Welsh composers? Is that something
Well,
we can hear in the music,
of
or
course not. I mean,
no?
I think all kinds of nationalism are deeply divisive and unhelpful. And in fact, it's very difficult. What do you put? People always ask you, what's your nationality?
Mhm.
And the trouble is, you say British and it has all sorts of associations with British music of the past. They think perhaps of Purcell, they might think of Britain, of Vaughan Williams, and so on. So, it's a kind of way of pigeonholing. No, there's nothing that's necessarily
That
Welsh
is
about my
true.
music.
But saying that, I still, for me, I would think you carry a lot of those sort of very fine. I mean, I think if we think of British composers, usually we have a very high kind of idea about, usually very skilled, very good in orchestration, very good in, and also I feel when I think of British music in comparison to, let's say, that very avant-garde music of Europe, British music has sort of a greater lightness, more audience friendly somehow. So,
Well, there is. I mean, I think there are two important aspects to that. One is, which of course is that Britain is an island,
mhm.
and islands tend to be more kind of insular, conservative generally, and also just because of the links with America through the English language, and American classical music culture is quite different from European classical music culture. But we're living in a time of immense kind of instability and change and flux when it comes to things like contemporary concert music.
Hmm.
And you know, it's something you wouldn't necessarily advise anyone to try and do, is make a living as a contemporary composer. It's a very strange thing to to pretend is a proper career.
Well, actually, as we were sort of announcing this interview with you here, we announced it as you know, you're somebody who's actually is truly a professional composer. And coming back to what I said in the beginning, uh, this is a fact that you know, you're working with some of the finest, you know, performers of the field today. So you are sort of the to-go-to guy. There's also, of course, if one look at your work, I can quickly realize that a lot of these also are, so I would call them high pressure gigs. Let's say you have to write, you know, long pieces for orchestra for very important occasions, for very important people, etc. So of course that it's, to some degree, it's also, is that ever sort of stressful? What is it like to be doing that right at the kind of edge, and you know that John Williams or whoever it is waiting for it, and
Well,
there you are.
I mean, the stressful thing about composing is it takes ages to compose, as you know. Uh, Being a composer yourself, it takes an awful lot of work and energy, and it's incredibly draining. Um, and you know, there's always too much to do because you have a, you know, and composing, and even as a professional composer, you know, you're earning money doing other things, teaching at universities, at colleges, you're traveling, festivals, and so organizing your time is incredibly difficult. And you know, there have been moments where I've woken up in the middle of the night just in a kind of cold sweat of, well, I've really blown it this time. I'm going to miss the deadline. It's finished. I'm not gonna.
Mm.
It's not going to happen. And I must admit, when I first wrote for John Williams, when he commissioned me to write a piece, I put myself under a ridiculous amount of pressure.
Mm.
You know, like, oh, this is going to be my best piece ever. It's for John Williams. This is really really important. That's the worst possible thing I could have done, of course, because it immediately makes you feel totally intimidated, and you can't go about your business in a kind of usual sort of day to day fashion. So it can be quite destructive. But you know, one has to just sort of get over that. Uh, you know, but it's yeah. There's always there are always lots of pieces to write, and they're always just kind of there in the background wherever I'm going about my daily business. The kind of general stress of having to do these things and get them finished by a certain time. I mean, there's several. As I'm saying this, there are several going around my head at the moment. You know, there's a
Yes, I know that you're currently working on a concerto, right?
yeah. I'm currently working on two different concertos. One is for
Oh,
my
two. That's
yeah,
it's already. I was thinking one. Oh my god! And now you're working. And how does that work? Did you work on two? So you're working on them?
no, one of them is for guitar plus orchestra,
Oh,
with orchestra, and the other one is for two guitars plus strings.
oh, plus strings. Yeah, I'm sorry. I know we
The one for two guitars
do
plus
too many
strings.
things. I'm not keeping up with you. But that it's so um amazing. And you're working on those at the same time.
Yeah, I
What
mean, I
happened
often
to you?
have three or four projects on the go at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Is
Um,
that common for you to do it that way?
yeah, it didn't used to be. It's becoming more so, but actually, it's very useful having pieces at different stages. In a way, it's sort of similar to playing an instrument, where it's quite useful to be practicing pieces that, you know, some are near completion, you're
Hmm.
polishing them, others are in the early stages, some are in the middle. And actually, composing, it's quite nice if you're doing a variety, you know, you've got a variety of different stages in the piece. If
Mm-hmm.
you're just working on one piece from beginning to end, that can be very good and focusing. But it
Mm.
means that you're always doing the same, you know, any one day you're doing the same kind of thing. So, for example, today, if I'm looking for material for a new section of this piece and I'm finding it difficult, I can just go to another piece and work on something which is not quite.
Right. I get that. But I guess you also, do you have to kind of say that, yeah, on Tuesdays I work on this, and or does it just go more naturally? How do you actually kind of
Oh, well, I work out roughly how long I think it'll take to write the piece
hmm.
in hours. And in fact, the way I work out commissions is on a daily rate.
Mm.
Um,
Oh, interesting.
because basically, then the daily rate seems very low. But then I say it's going to take all these days.
No, 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 that is the little bit the
But it's, yeah,
painful
so I work
truth.
out how long it's going to take, and then I put that time in my diary. So I ring fence it.
and sorry to be so, but I'm sure a lot of people actually find that quite interesting. And when you talk about days, will you literally block off the entire day, or will you then, like now we're doing this this interview? Are you kind of, did that ruin your day, or are you now working this in between your?
No, well, today, for example, after this interview, I've got to do my end of year reports for all the guitar chair music at the Royal Academy of Music.
All right, so we didn't really ruin your day.
And then tonight I have a
It's
big.
already ruined. No.
So I mean, yeah, I'll put in chunks of time. There was a time when I felt that I could only really compose if I put 2 or 3 days aside and was really kind of into the headspace. But then I read a great interview with a novelist called Roddy Doyle, which completely changed my approach. He said that, he wrote a book which won the Booker Prize.
Mm-hmm.
Paddy Clark, ha ha ha. And he said that basically he was a full-time teacher when he was writing that. And he used
Wow.
to write it in, he could grab 20 minutes here, 40 minutes there,
Fabulous.
and then do a whole, and for me, the thing is that the planning takes a lot of brain space. The sort of really sort of
Mm-hmm.
planning it all out and thinking very carefully about all the different aspects. And then once you've got the plan in place, you can go in and work on little details. So, you're working on one little section, knowing that the rest is all kind of planned out and you're just homing in on one section. But also what I do when I plan time for the piece is I said to a friend of mine, Will Todd, who's a composer, lives in my hometown. And I said, well, what do you do? And sometimes things come in and you run out of time. And he says, well, whenever I put time in the diary for a piece, I put in 25% more time than I need
Mm.
because I know that things will come in. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm 50 years old. Why didn't I think of that? That's so obvious. you know. So
Easily.
it's
No, that is fantastic. Well, uh, fascinating. And of course, now preparing a little bit for today, I was kind of trying to get some kind of way to approach you here about now talking a little bit about your music, because uh, in some ways we of course realize quite quickly that almost each piece you ever written has some kind of entirely different setup and sort of a kind of uniqueness to it. But yet, of course, there is some kind of a feeling that is perhaps overlapping. And I guess you have a kind of an intention, or you have an interest in kind of a little bit uh, um, making us look a little bit different on time. Is that something you would agree with? And I thought that it was very nice, that little thing you said in it was a presentation from the Omni Foundation with David Russel a few months ago, where he played your beautiful long suite. And that first movement, it was something about a monk that was listening to a bird for 300 years, right?
yeah,
I
yeah.
hope I'm not destroying this.
Well, that's it. Yeah,
But he lost track of time.
yeah.
And then I realized I think that this was very kind of pictured very well. Something I think that you're doing in a lot of pieces. You're kind of switching us in. You're making us see time and experience time quite differently than what we're used to. Is that, am I on the right track somehow?
Oh, totally. That is a great observation. Great question. No, absolutely. I mean, sometimes people ask you, what is your music about? You have to summarize it very quickly, and very quickly for me, time and place are very two important aspects. And the time is, yes, as you say, real, because basically, the canvas for music is time. That's what it is. That's the frame. So what you do within that frame, of course, is very important. Um, and time can refer to historical time. That David Russell piece, for example, is based on music from the 11th, 12th, and early 13th century. Um, and so it's kind of referring backwards to that sort of timelessness. But also, time can be suspended. You can have music that makes time seem to go very fast, other music which is timeless. And so, yeah, these sorts of things I play with a lot, and moving from one kind of music to another. So some very active music to some very static music, some very still music. So aspects like how much is going on, how quickly the harmony is changing, all these things are kind of key to the planning stages of writing the pieces.
Mm.
Um, and I try and yeah, make things as varied as possible. So rather than trying to sort of develop an individual voice or individual style, I actually spend my time doing the exact opposite of that and trying to make every piece
Right, right, yeah. Almost like you're liberated a little bit from, uh, because I feel sometimes there can be a pressure. People almost feel pressured to create a kind of a unique style that they then need to stick with for the rest of their life. But in your case, it's very liberating because it's almost like your style is to not do that. It's to always be fresh. But still, there is a kind of, it's almost like you don't need to try. It will come through somehow anyway, right? Somehow there,
Yeah, exactly.
you're coming
That's
through.
a very good point, which actually very few people really get to grips with. People are worried about developing their style, but you know, we're each individuals and we will do things in a very quirky way. Like we all have a different style of talking, of walking, of telling jokes, of interacting publicly. So our music will be unique to us, however hard we try for it
Mhm.
not to be.
Yes.
And I think there's a great quote which I always come back to, which is W.H. Auden, British poet who worked with Benjamin Britten and various others. He said the trouble is with artists is they spend the first half of their lives imitating other people, and the second half imitating themselves. Which
And so you try to, but you do imitate yourself, I guess, too. That it must be said, of course. But
well, I'm
is that
sure.
something one should that you're um, don't want to do, or but you still do it somehow, I guess.
Well, it's a
How
tricky
do you?
thing. I mean,
Mhm.
you know, in terms of looking at sort of model people, I mean, I think of people like Miles Davis or Stravinsky or Picasso. These are people who completely reinvented themselves on a regular
Now I
basis.
see what you mean. Yeah, sort of.
But you know, even with Miles Davis, you hear his sound, you know it's him, whether it's
Completely. Yeah.
whatever style he's playing. And the same with Stravinsky. You know, you hear a couple of chords of Stravinsky, you know it's Stravinsky just from the way his sort of musical DNA is all over it.
Mhm.
But he still manages to write in lots of different styles. So those are the kind of the ideals.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
That is so nice. Well, I would like to also perhaps let us perhaps talk a little bit about that thing about time,
Hmm.
actually. And because what you are able to do very often is create these very long pieces, whether they're concertos or sort of really long pieces. So that is a kind of a very extra sort of special pressure. Let's say if you're making something that is bigger, the same like a building, I guess with something bigger, you need a stronger foundation, sort of
Hmm.
a stronger structural foundation. Is that true?
Absolutely. I mean, when I'm writing large scale pieces, I spend a long time planning, a long time, drawing the blueprints very carefully. I mean, the concerto I'm writing at the moment for Miami is in 11 different sections. They're all based on different artworks. And I use the artworks as a kind of starting point, you know, for musical ideas and kind of sound worlds that are in my head. Again, Benjamin Britten said a very profound thing once. He said that composing is a bit like driving towards a building in the fog. You know, at first you've kind of got a vague idea of what it might be on the horizon, but nothing is at all remotely um, uh, defined. And as you get closer, so it becomes a bit more obvious what's going on. And this sort of vagueness and this vague shape gradually gets more and more detailed the closer you get. And that's definitely how I work. I mean, I'm often imagining these incredibly beautiful and amazing sounds in my head, and then dreaming that I'll be able to capture these.
Mm.
You know, it's a bit like sort of, you know, you go for a walk in a beautiful landscape and you look around. I just want to capture this. You know, somehow take it home,
Mm.
bottle it up, and just have it at home. And I think this is what I'm always trying to do with composing. So the bit where you're imagining the sounds quite near the beginning of the process is an amazingly creative and exciting moment. But of course, as soon as you do try and actually put it on paper or organize the sounds, then of course it comes nowhere near the fantasy.
Mhm.
Absolutely nowhere near. It's always a complete disappointment. Um, And, you know,
To us. No, no, I see what you mean. But I guess what I'm hearing is also there's a large amount of reference, and it's almost like you're building an entire fantasy world. And
yeah,
of course, these thing that you're going to present to us as a composition, in a sense, will be some sort of top of the iceberg of your fantasy world.
yeah.
That's kind of what I'm hearing from you. Like you have this
That's, again, a very
very
good observation.
powerful
I think,
reference, and
yeah.
now you're just actually, like you say, you mean you can't reproduce a day, but it will be some sort of just a moment of it, just a little blink of it.
I mean, for example, I wrote a concerto a few years ago for violin, guitar, strings, and percussion. It was based on Italo Calvino's novel Invisible Cities, which is it's the most amazing book. It's incredible. It's just lots of tiny chapters describing these fantasy cities. The idea is that you have Marco Polo talking to Genghis Khan and describing his travels, but it's just so beautiful. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to find out more about Calvino. I wanted to find out more about Invisible Cities. So the way I could justify the time in order to do that was to write a piece about it. So, so I then had to research it in detail because I'm going to write a piece about it, and then try and recreate these kind of fantasy worlds. But it's not that the audience has to kind of share all this kind of background and knowledge and stuff. All it's really for is for me to get to the point of a blank piece of manuscript paper to a full piece of manuscript paper. That's the kind of main priority as a composer, is to transfer empty paper into filled paper and have
I guess that's your job. I guess
that
that's
is,
what you're supposed to do.
and you know, and how it sounds, and the kind of, and so from a listener's point of view, you know, they don't have to go into all that detail that I've been into, or even find out half of it. In fact, you know, I needn't even mention it. I mean, in the case of that piece, the piece is actually called Invisible Cities, but it could have just been called Concerto for Violin, Guitar, Strings, and Percussion. In a way, all this kind of fantasy stuff is for me in order to get ideas and creative stuff down, and to create sounds which then are sort of pushed out there. And if people want to research that stuff and analyze it, they're very welcome to. Some people have, but you certainly don't need to do that to enjoy the musical service. You know?
And do you ever feel that some of these, let's say, fantasy worlds that they call you back, and that you kind of can go back to the same world and then create a different music out of the same kind of?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, this is sequels are always a big problem. You know, I think Godfather 2 is probably the only half decent sequel ever made. Um, but it is difficult to recreate, especially the time. You know, some composers like Pierre Boulez will go back and revise. He used to go back and revise the same piece for years and years and years. You know, whereas for me, when I see an old piece, it's there and it's basically a sort of capsule in time. I can't
No,
enter.
I meant more a little bit like the idea that we could then create a different music from the same kind of reference point. That I always just fascinate me. For example, like when you do something, and like you say, you may have had a particular reference. The question, if you have done the same thing 10 years later, I don't think the music would have been the same.
No, it would be very different. Absolutely. No, absolutely, it would be different. But you know, what I do is use musical material more than once. You know, this idea that every work has to be, you know, completely original and be full of entirely new stuff. I mean, when you generate musical material, it can go in lots and lots of different ways, and you can play with it in different ways. They're like ingredients for cooking, you know. So I will use sometimes the same chord sequences, sometimes the same um, sort of ideas behind a piece. You won't necessarily hear that you couldn't necessarily listen to two side by side and say, oh, that's definitely a copy of that, or I can see that those two are basically the same chord sequence, because things are often, they're just reworked and sort of hidden and arranged. And that happens a lot. I mean, all composers have always done that, some more than others. And this kind of obsession with kind of constantly being original is very much a sort of late 19th century concept that doesn't really fit nicely with music making, really.
No. And let's say then, I mean, let's say in which way, You at this point, if you look back 10 or 15 years back, in which way do you write music differently now than you did then?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. I mean, not possibly not as differently as I'd like to. um, I
Good
think
answer. That
I think it's important that you keep changing, you keep adapting, you keep moving forward. And what's interesting though often is that people who analyze my music or write about it often have really insightful observations that I
Mm.
just can't see. I just don't know.
that is that is amazing.
Um, there's one thing that I wrote a Theorbo concerto a couple of years ago,
Oh yes.
and Jonathan Leithwood wrote a program note essay for that, and it was just brilliant, beautiful writing. And he described the fact that throughout my career I've been working on these kind of miniatures which stood alone, and you move from one to another and one to another, and they were all complete contrasting things.
Mm.
And he said, as time has gone on, so I've become more and more interested with joining everything up and transitioning things and morphing from one into another. And this kind of represents the way forward. And I thought, well, that's a very interesting narrative.
Mm.
I
Mm.
mean, of course, none of these things are linear or hold true.
Mm. Mm.
But I do find myself also, falling back into particular habits. I've written a lot of perpetual motion type pieces, slow, medium, and fast ones, not just necessarily fast ones. Where there's a continuous
Mm-hmm.
flow of eighth notes or 16th notes or so on. And this is a trope I keep coming back to. Then there's a
Mm.
trope of a kind of completely open, empty, very slow, calm trope. I mean, that comes back from a piece I wrote called The Garden of Cosmic Speculation. That sort of feel comes back in the piano concerto. So
Mm.
there are certain tropes that keep coming back. And I suppose I would prefer it if I was constantly being original and coming up with new stuff. But the funny thing is, the older you get and the more you've already written, the harder it is to do anything different,
Mm.
because you've kind of done. It's a bit like uh, a box of chocolates. You sort of start off and you think, oh yeah, I'll have my favorites first. So you do all the kind of obvious things, all your big ideas, and then you think, oh, God, I've only got lime cream left. That's not good. So I think, well, maybe I'll have another praline from.
Oh,
So I don't know. I mean, I think it's a slightly. I tend not to look back. I think that's the truth.
mm.
Always thinking about the next piece, the next piece, the next piece. Um, it's a shame because I suppose I should spend more time kind of promoting my back catalogue and kind of doing all that sort of stuff, or even sort of slowing down a bit. But funnily enough, the thing about composing that I find the most interesting is the ideas at the very beginning, and then working with players.
Right, right. And that is a returning thing. And I also know that apart from these two concertos that we were talking about, I know you also been writing a composition for Agnello Desiderio, the Italian
Yeah.
guitar virtuoso.
Yeah, well, I finished that actually in January 2020 because the first performance was planned for
Oh,
Moscow
I
in
see.
March 2020. And of course, like everything, it's been cancelled. So,
Yes.
um, I mean, it's great. What I also like about working with certain people is I don't want players to be polite. I want them to tell me how it is. And this really the first time I worked with David Russel in 2007, I said, look, David, what I want is for you to, if this piece to be really, ideal for your concerts, you want to play it in your concerts, so if there's anything about it you don't like,
Mm-hmm.
rather than smile sweetly and say, yeah, it's great, play it once and then forget about it, tell me what I can do to make it better, basically. And I've always had this attitude with people. And David said, right, okay. So the next thing I get a sort of detailed list of the things that he thinks, and it's wonderful because actually, that's that will mean the piece ended up being a lot better as a result. And then when I came to write the Cantigas piece a few years later, about 7 or 8 years later, I knew David the way he thought so well through the first experience that I was able to sort of uh, fit his playing much more and his tastes much more closely the second time.
And that is a phenomenal piece. And as I mentioned earlier, it was really, at least for me, one of the highlights of that Omni on location concert that came out
Well, I mean,
way
David,
back. That was a
may,
fascinating. But I'm a little bit curious. I'm just very curious because I know how you kind of tailor your pieces towards the performer. And why I'm not asking about the Agnello Desiderio pieces, of course, because he's a very kind of, let's say, a very highly eccentric performer. So I'm very, very curious to see how you have perhaps used that, or
Well, the
how do
pieces.
you write music for Agnello Desiderio? I mean, and I mean, I'm with a lot of respect, but of course he is a very sort of free performer. So is that,
Yeah.
so
Well,
that what you're going to write is not exactly, he's going to make it his own.
oh, totally. I mean, this is, yeah, I mean, this is why I mentioned the thing about change. So, when I first heard Agnello, I mean, millions of years ago, I absolutely hated his concerts.
Millions of
Millions, I don't know, 2005 or something.
yes, I know.
But I hated the concert. There he was tearing this music
This is
apart.
going out live, by the way, so
Oh no, that's fine.
it's going
I don't
out.
care. I'll tell him. He'll laugh. Um, I know him very well now. I absolutely hated it. But then I thought, well, why was my reaction so strong? What was it that he did to offend me so much? Why is it that I need the pulse to be there in a certain way, and why? And then I heard him again a year later, and I thought, oh right, I get it. Shit, this guy is absolutely phenomenal. This guy has a musical imagination that is beyond dreaming. And then, you hear his brother, Gennaro, the violinist, and you hear his groups. And there's this kind of culture of expression and molto liberamente, And so I said to him, when I write a piece, it's this. And so I always ask people for a playlist, what music do you listen to? What do you love? What are you into?
Hmm.
And I gave Agnello various choices early on because, again, it's about tailoring. I don't think composing is about a composer issuing sort of, masterpieces from a mountain saying, "Here, play these great works." I see composing basically as being a sort of collaboration between the performer and the composer. The performer wants to play a piece in his concert. The performer's job is a very tough one. I mean, I know because I did it for many, many years. You have to walk out on stage and you have to play stuff. You have to have total faith in it. You have to be really behind it and giving it what for, and it to be a joy. So, you have to discuss with players and think, well, how am I going to get to that point?
Mm-hmm.
So in the end, we decided to do a piece based on Italian opera entirely.
Oh.
So it's actually a potpourri
Oh,
of
lovely.
Puccini and Verdi and
Oh,
Rossini. They've all been sort of mashed around a bit, a kind of modern day Rossiniana.
oh,
Um,
lovely.
so so I wrote the piece and of course got it to him much later than he would have liked. He absolutely worked his backside off on it just before the premiere in Moscow, which was then
Yeah.
cancelled because of
The
COVID.
shame.
But then because it was cancelled, there was like a further conversation. Now you've worked on it a bit. What do you think? And then we had this great conversation where he said, well, I want to put this at the end of my concerts, but I can't because it's too long.
Oh, yeah.
I said, all right, here we go. Which bits don't you like? What should we cut? What should we do? And so we took 19 minutes down to 12 minutes. Just like that. In terms of which bits were his favorites. But this is important because something that you may have heard me say before is that people never complain a piece is too short. you know, and so and now the piece.
No, I do agree with you in that, in a sense, but I must say there is also, of course, as we maybe also during these times a little bit more, there is also a room and space for longer listening and for long, like for example, this is a talk, this is sort of like a podcast style, but this is the kind of, whoever is listening all the way here, this is a kind of a way to enjoy longer content. So of course there is that. We shouldn't forget about the value of long content too, of course.
Of course not. I mean, no, absolutely. I mean, what I found there as a composition teacher is that people often say things with 10 minutes and they could have said them with 3. Ideally you want someone to say something with 40 minutes that's got 40 minutes of content in it. It's matching the time, the content with it. There's a great quote, I think it's actually Winston Churchill of all people, who said, "Sorry, I've written you such a long letter. I didn't have time to write a short one." It's
Good
that
one.
idea of sort of editing and also certain kinds of music need space. I mean, I know you're a big fan of Indian music, and you couldn't, that's not something that's ever going to be short. You've got to get into it. It's got to have over time, and there are different ways of listening, etc. Of course, So don't get me wrong, but just talking with Agnello, you just think, well, that it needs to be that sort of length for the end of the concert, and if it's at
Oh,
the end,
absolutely.
people
Absolutely.
concentrate. It's like, and that's the other thing. Where is this piece going in the concert? What will it
Oh,
sit
yeah.
next to? What will be the piece before it? What will be after it? Will it be before the interval? Will it be after the interval? You know,
Hmm.
I always like premieres before the interval. It means then I can have a drink in the interval, and people have already heard the piece. um,
No, and I mean, I think uh, uh, um, saying that what is unusual about you is that you manage to. I think for a lot of composers, they can have some sort of pieces that will go into programs. But in your case, you have a lot of very long compositions that are actually frequently played.
hmm.
So I guess you did fill out your amount of content. I mean, in a way, it is. We already know with players that it's very difficult to get them to play new music to introduce new repertoire. But in your case, it's no problem. They give you the red carpet and play 15, 20 minutes of your music, no problem.
Well, again, it's about building the relationship with the player. I mean, Zoran Dukic this week is recording a piece of mine.
Mm.
It's called Cinema Paradiso. Um,
Okay.
it's nothing to do with the movie Cinema Paradiso, but to
Mhm.
do with cinema in general. So each of the six movements is based on a different director. Now, he's a big fan of film. I know a little bit about film. Zoran's brother is a film director,
Right.
and we've had many conversations over many years about all these sorts of things. So what I'm also bringing into the piece is our kind of our conversations, our relationships. It's a kind of it's a very personalized thing. And also, I think, if one again tries to write in a way that the player their player's hands will really enjoy the things that you're doing from a physical, visceral
Mhm.
point of view, as well as the style of the music and the stuff, so that it shows off what they do and they kind of enjoy it. It's a bit like, I mean, there's that old movie, Being John Malkovich.
Right.
I don't know if you ever saw it.
It's really funny, actually. I mean, it's
you know and,
classic.
and, and so what I'm trying to do is sort of put myself in the body of another player, and thinking about how they would do it.
Mm.
And this for me is what keeps the music different.
Mm, mm, mm,
If it was
mm.
my playing in every piece I wrote for other people,
Mhm.
the music would be much more similar and probably not so
Sure,
interesting.
sure, I get that. But I mean, I also know. I mean, my point of view is a little different because mostly I play my own music, so I'm kind of stuck in the other corner. But to be honest, it's also a challenge and it's a skill that I guess that you have developed to basically be able to completely tailor pieces for performers. This is a kind of a very attractive thing, of course, here that you can do that. Who can do that? To tailor somebody a concerto and so on. It's like getting, you're not just buying your generic suit now, where you're going to the tailor and you're gonna look great because this suit is made for you. So it's a little bit like that, isn't it?
Well, I think it really boils down to the fact that I always put the performer first. In the food chain. The idea of the composer coming first, again, is a very recent phenomenon. In
Hmm.
the Baroque period, when people used to go to operas, they're going for the singers. They're not going for the composer. You're not going to go and watch Handel. You're going to go and watch the latest castrati soprano or the latest
Totally.
Tetra arias. And and the kind of the mythic sort of this side for me, the idea of the sort of genius composer producing masterworks which then everyone can sort of look around them like they're in some kind of museum. It's not my way. Basically it's a job. Someone wants a piece. What do they want? Okay, I'll fulfill it. It's a little bit more pragmatic. It's a bit more
Hmm.
craftsman-like. But again, there's still plenty of room to get the art in. I mean, a classic example might be, I mean, in that video you mentioned of David playing my piece Cantigas de Santiago, he was playing them in this 12th century church, and the church itself has these beautiful artworks in it, gargoyles or internal. There's one amazing statue of the Virgin, and there's all these beautiful artworks. But of course, they're entirely there for pragmatic reasons. You want to decorate a place of worship, so it's not as if you've got an artist going, "Well, what shall I make?"
Totally.
It's
Yeah.
It has
But
that.
there's a lot of music. I mean, a lot of classics were often written for a certain occasion, and that was the
Absolutely.
way it is. So, we were coming back to the thing here about you being truly kind of a professional composer in today's world, and that is possible. And in a way, you answered that a little bit earlier, but I'm sure that, of course, there would be a lot of people who would be quite. You said it was a gradual process, and here you are kind of in this situation where I mean, a lot of people, a lot of composers can take them time to get their music to be played, but here you are on the other end, people are sort of chasing you to have you now do these fantastic tailor-made
It's a
pieces
strange thing.
for them. Everyone wants one, so is there like some kind of recommendation or kind of nice little tip you could give to
Oh,
people
plenty.
who would want to be like you?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know if it will be exact. Um, I think we're saying this, and yeah, I'm 57 years old. I've been around a long time. But you wouldn't have interviewed me for this 15 years ago. I wouldn't have been that well known. Um, it's a very very gradual process. This is the main thing, is that at first what you must do, the best advocate for your own music, often if you're a guitarist wanting to be a composer, the best advocate for your own music is either you as a performer or one of your friends to perform your music. So what happened with me is that I played my own music, either voice and guitar or with the quartet. Other people heard that music. They said, that's really nice. Some people played it. Others said, can you write something for me? So you write stuff for free for a very long time. And you kind of are sort of happy to enjoy opportunities. I mean, I have a lot of young composers who I teach and who I advise and who I look at doing various different things. And the thing is that there are too many temptations that get in the way of really focusing on your compositional work. I mean, it takes a lot of time. It pays you no money for a long, long time. And I'm not suggesting that you should just wait because eventually you'll get money, because you don't really. I mean, most of the money I've got from composing is not through the actual composing, but through performances of things or rights, or being invited to festivals, or being
Right.
invited to do bits and pieces, or getting nice academic positions, etc.
Mhm.
Um, but I think it's just this gradual thing. I mean, for me, it was a compulsion as much as anything.
Mm.
Is that why are you a composer? Is it because you're a genius? Is it because you're talented? He said, no, it's because I refuse to do anything else. And again, it's
Mm.
like all these things that are hard work. If you want to be a player, you've got to really put the work in. And for the young players, like leaving college, there's that tempting time where they think, well, I could do this. I'll earn lots of money. It'll be fine. But then to keep the work going, and to know that actually,
Yeah.
work and income are two entirely separate things. Um,
Yes, and they cannot really be taken as some kind of approval of your music or something like that. That's a kind of
oh
a
no,
dead
not at
end.
all.
It's
Not
a
at
way
all.
too complicated for that. And yes, well,
But one other piece of advice, which I think is very
mhm.
important, and that is to meet as many people as you possibly can who are in the guitar world, and people know
Mm,
who you are. People here,
fantastic.
because it's if you're a player or a composer, if you're around and people see you and they meet you, next time they see you, they'll remember you. Next time they'll remember you. Building up these kind of social links, these kind of
Absolutely.
interpersonal links, incredibly important. There was a book recently about the visual art world, and it just looked at the careers of various 20th century artists, and the ones who are the best connected are the ones who have the best careers. You know, so
See, that is fantastic advice here, and this has been so wonderful for Guitar City to have you here. And well, I think we're kind of almost down by the hour here. So I would really like to thank you so much for doing this, and we look forward to hear your new concertos and your uh, Gaussiana, or what would you call it, Agnello Desideriana, that fantastic uh, other piece coming out. So this just been absolutely wonderful, and Thank you so much.
No, it's been a great pleasure. Really nice to talk to you, and thanks for the really probing and interesting questions, Johannes.
My pleasure. Fantastic. You have a great day, and I hope you enjoy grading those exams or what that was. Did you?
Okay, thank you.
Anyway, thank you so much, Steve.
Thank you.